The auctioneer's voice broke twice before he finished the sentence. $3, he said, and cleared his throat as though the number embarrassed him, which it did. $3. Do I hear 4? Nobody heard 4. The crowd in the yard of Hardin Creek's general store stood in a loose half-circle in the January cold, and not one of them raised a hand. They were not looking at the auctioneer. They were looking at the woman on the step. Tall, full-figured, dressed in a widow's black that had seen 2 harsh winters. Her hands folded in front of her, the way a person folds their hands when they have decided that what is happening to them is not worth the energy of protest. Her name was Mara Voss. She was 34 years old. She had not spoken a word in 11 months. $3 going once, the auctioneer said. From the far edge of the crowd, a man in a canvas coat raised 2 fingers, not a bid so much as an acknowledgement. His name was Caleb Holt. He ran a cattle operation 8 miles up the mountain and had not come down to town for anything in 4 months. And no one standing in that yard was entirely sure what had brought him down today, of all days, for this. Sold, the auctioneer said, with undisguised relief. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel right now and hit the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what brought Mara Voss to that step, and what she finally said when she opened her mouth again after 11 months of silence, it is going to change the way you think about what it means to speak, and when, and why. It had begun in February of 1883 in the flat, wind-punished country east of Laramie, Wyoming, where Mara had spent 7 years keeping a farm with her husband, Ernst Voss. Ernst had been a decent man and a poor farmer, which is a combination that keeps a woman tired without making her miserable. He had died in March. A kick from a horse, a week of fever, and then nothing, and left Mara with $40 in cash, $300 in debt, and a farm the creditors collected before the ground had fully thawed over his grave. She had a brother in Montana she had not seen in 6 years, and a letter that had arrived in April saying he was dead too. She had no children. She had a trunk, a wool coat, and the $40 minus train fare to Wyoming Territory, minus 2 nights at a boarding house in Cheyenne where the proprietress had looked her over with the measuring look Mara had known her whole life, that slow top-to-bottom accounting, and charged her $3 more than the posted rate without offering an explanation. By the time the Territorial Relief Office in Casper suggested the Hardin Creek Placement Program, a system by which widows in reduced circumstances could be assigned as housekeepers to ranchers in need of domestic labor, with the placement fee paid by the county, Mara had $11 left and 4 days of food. She had not planned the silence. It had simply arrived one morning in late February, when a county official had asked her to state her name and occupation for the placement register, and she had opened her mouth and found nothing there. Not grief, not terror, just a quiet that had settled into the base of her throat like silt at the bottom of a river. She had written her name instead. The official had looked at her with something between pity and impatience and had written "mute" in the margin of his ledger, which was not accurate but was not entirely wrong either. The placement program was supposed to work through a voucher system. A rancher would submit a request. A woman would be assigned. The county would pay the housekeeper's first month and the rancher would cover the rest. What no one had explained to Mara was that Hardin Creek had run out of county vouchers in October. What had replaced the voucher system, apparently, was a placement auction. $3 was the amount Caleb Holt had paid to the Garfield County Relief Program for the administrative processing of Mara's assignment to his household. It was not, the county clerk would later insist, a purchase price. It was a placement fee. The distinction mattered enormously to everyone except Mara. who had watched the transaction from the step of the general store, with her hands folded and her face arranged into something that communicated nothing at all. The wagon driver who took her up the mountain road was a short man named Peavy, who had driven the Holt supply route for going on 6 years and who spent the first 2 miles of the journey watching her sidelong before deciding she was not going to speak, and therefore he was free to speak for both of them. "He don't talk either, so you two ought to get along fine," Peavy said. "Hasn't been what you'd call sociable since his wife passed. 14 months ago this coming March. Influenza. She was gone in 8 days. He paused. "There was a daughter, 7 years old. Name of Pearl. She don't talk much either, come to think of it. That house has gone real quiet." He clicked his tongue at the mule. "The last woman they sent up lasted 11 days. The one before that made it 3 weeks before she told me to turn the wagon around. I ain't saying that to discourage you, ma'am. I'm saying it so you know what you're going into with your eyes open." The road climbed through lodgepole pine and bare aspen, and the sky was the flat white of a sky that is deciding whether to snow. When the Holt property came into view, a main house, a barn, a smaller outbuilding, all set against a ridge of dark timber, Mara could see from a quarter-mile away that the fences needed work, that the barn door hung at an angle suggesting a broken hinge, that the window in the east room of the house was covered with oilskin rather than glass. It was not the neglect of a lazy man. The woodpile was large and well split. The corral was sound. The neglect was specific, surgical. It had touched only the things a woman would have noticed and a man alone had stopped seeing. Caleb Holt met the wagon in the yard, took Mara's trunk without asking, and set it on the porch. He was a large man, not fat but constructed, wide through the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that comes from spending most of one's time alone. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. "You're the housekeeper," he said. She met his eyes and gave one nod. "There's a girl, 7. She'll want watching." A pause. "Kitchen's through the back. It needs work." Another pause, longer. "Peavy will bring supplies. End of the week. You need something before then. Write it on the board by the stove." He turned and went back inside. Mara stood in the yard for a moment, with the cold coming down through the pines and the barn door swinging quietly on its broken hinge. Then she picked up her coat from the porch step where it had slid from her trunk, went inside and found the kitchen. The framework had not done it justice. The stove was buried under the residue of a year of cooking performed without care. Burnt grease, spilled flour, a pot that had been set down hot on the wooden counter and left a perfect charred ring. The basin held a pail of water that had been sitting long enough to develop a faint smell. 3 sacks of flour stood open against the wall, and the evidence of mice in each one was thorough and long-standing. A single candle had been stuck to the table with its own whammers and burned down to a nub. On the kitchen table, however, and this was what stopped her, there was a child's drawing, done in charcoal on the back of an envelope. A house. Smoke coming from the chimney. A woman standing in front of it. The woman in the drawing was large, deliberately, carefully large, with 2 thick lines for arms extended outward as though offering something or waiting to receive it. The drawing had no name on it. It had been there a while. The edges were soft with handling. Mara stood looking at it for a moment. Then she rolled up her sleeves and began. She had the stove clean by nightfall and a pot of salt pork and dried bean soup on by the time the sky went dark. The smell of it moved through the house, rich, mineral, warm. The smell of a house that has a woman in it again, which is a particular smell and one that cannot be manufactured. She heard a door open upstairs. Footsteps on the landing, small ones. The girl appeared in the kitchen doorway. Pearl Holt was 7 years old and had her father's stillness and her mother's coloring. Dark eyes, dark hair pulled back in a braid that had not been redone in several days. She stood in the doorway and looked at Mara with the frank, undefended assessment that children give to things that are new and not yet decided upon. Mara looked back at her. She ladled soup into a bowl, set it on the table, and pulled out the chair closest to the stove. Pearl came and sat. She ate without speaking. After a moment she looked up. "Papa says you can't talk," Pearl said. Mara considered this. She placed one finger beside her mouth in a gesture that was not quite a shrug and not quite a confirmation. Something in between. The gesture of a woman who prefers to leave some things open. Pearl looked at her bowl. "I don't talk much either," she said. "Since, Mama." They finished the meal in the quiet that had apparently become the common condition of this house. When Pearl's bowl was empty, Mara touched the girl's braid. Twice, gently, the way you'd touch a bird that had landed near you. Pearl looked at her, then looked down. She did not move away. Caleb Holt appeared in the doorway at 7:30. He ate standing at the counter, his back half turned, with the efficient, affectless speed of a man who has stopped treating meals as occasions. When he was finished, he set the bowl in the basin. He did not look at the stove, which was clean. He did not look at the table, which had been scrubbed. He moved toward the door, and then, a pause so brief Mara almost missed it, he turned back and looked at the charcoal drawing still lying on the table. "She drew that in November," he said. To no one in particular, to the room. Then he went upstairs. The days arranged themselves into a pattern. Mara was up before the house, the stove lit, bread set to rise before the light was fully in the windows. By the end of the first week, the kitchen smelled the way a kitchen is supposed to smell: yeast and wood smoke, rendered lard and dried sage. Pearl had taken to appearing in the kitchen door each morning before breakfast, sometimes carrying something: a pine cone, a piece of interesting bark. Once a small brown feather she set on the table beside Mara's flour tin, without comment or explanation. On the 9th day, Mara found the water in the yard pump was going brown and muddy, which meant silt in the line. She spent 3 hours in the cold, digging down to the joint where the freeze had cracked the wooden collar, packed it with pine resin and burlap, and had clean water running again by the time Caleb came in from the upper pasture. He stood looking at the repaired joint for a moment. Then he looked at her hands, which were red with cold and dirty to the elbow. "You didn't have to do that," he said. She wiped her hands on her apron and went inside. On the 14th day, Pearl fell asleep at the kitchen table after supper. Her cheek pressed against her folded arms, her breathing slowing into the deep, even rhythm of a child who is finally comfortable enough to sleep somewhere other than her own bed. Mara sat across from her for a long time, without moving, listening to the wind work its way through the gaps in the north wall, and watching the small face of this girl who had not properly belonged anywhere since March. She did not move Pearl. She got a blanket from the chest by the door and laid it over the girl's shoulders, and stayed at the table with her until the candle burned low. She did not hear Caleb come down the stairs. She heard him stop at the kitchen doorway. She did not look up. After 43 seconds, she counted them. He went back up without speaking. The next morning, there was a bundle of fresh-cut firewood stacked beside her door that had not been there the night before. At the midpoint of her 3rd week, a letter arrived with a supply wagon. She could tell from the way Peavy held it, slightly away from himself, the way you'd hold something you weren't sure about, that it was not ordinary correspondence. She took it from him and read it in the kitchen. It was from a man named Aldous Creed, who identified himself as a representative of the Garfield County Relief Administration, The letter informed her that her placement at the Holt property had been arranged under a provision that was currently under legal review. Pending the resolution of that review, her assignment might be terminated and her position re-tendered. The letter was formal and pleasant, in the way that letters are formal and pleasant when they contain a threat the writer prefers not to state outright. She set the letter on the table and stood looking at it for a long time. She did not tell Caleb. She went and made bread instead, the sourdough she had started from scratch in the second week, fed every morning, kept in a clay pot by the warmest corner of the stove. She shaped the loaves and set them to rise and tried to think through what the letter meant and what she could do about it without speaking. Because speaking was still the thing she had not done, and she was not certain she could. She had not intended to stop speaking for 11 months. She had not made a vow. The silence had arrived, and she had found she could not locate the mechanism to end it, not the words themselves, but the authority to speak them, the fundamental conviction that her voice had a right to take up space in a room. 11 months of being processed and assessed and placed and moved had apparently convinced some deep and irrational part of her that the world preferred her this way. Aldous Creed arrived on a Tuesday, 3 days after the letter. He came in a hired buggy from Casper with a county clerk and a man Mara had never seen before, heavy-set, florid, with the particular confidence of a man who was accustomed to arriving and having things arranged. His name, she would learn, was Dunmore Fitch. He was a county commissioner. He was also, it emerged during the conversation that Caleb had with the three of them on the porch, a conversation Mara heard through the kitchen window while she kept her hands moving through bread dough. The man who had proposed the placement auction system in the first place and who had received the $3 fees, and who now wished to renegotiate the terms of the placements, which in practice meant he wished to terminate them and reissue them to families who would pay more. "The woman hasn't even got a voice," Fitch said, loud enough that his voice carried through the oilskin-patched window. "You're getting the worst of the lot and paying full county rate. Let me get you someone who can actually communicate." There was a pause. "She communicates fine," Caleb said. "Holt, I'm offering you an upgrade at no cost." "I don't want an upgrade." Mara had stopped moving her hands in the dough. She was standing very still. "There are 7 other placements affected by this review," Fitch said. 7 other households. I am trying to resolve this in an orderly... "When did you last audit the placement fees?" Caleb said. His voice had gone flat and specific, the voice of a man who has moved past the general conversation and into a particular one. A silence. "I keep records," Caleb said. "I keep records of everything. 8 placements at $3 each. That's $24 in county fees. I've seen the county's accounts. The administrative cost of this program is $11, which means $13 went somewhere it is not accounted for." Another pause. "I have the ledger copies. I requested them in November." The county clerk was obliging. "Asanya, Asanadan." Mara was not breathing. "I would strongly suggest," Caleb said, very quietly, "that you get back in that buggy." She heard the porch boards flex under shifting weight. She heard the creak of the buggy. She heard it turn and start back down the mountain road. Then she heard Caleb's boots on the steps and the kitchen door open, and he was standing in the kitchen looking at her with the bread dough still on her hands and her eyes very wide. "He'll be back," Caleb said. "He'll bring a lawyer. When he does, I'll need someone who can tell the judge what she saw and heard." He paused. "I know you don't." He stopped, started again. "I know you've had reasons." He was not comfortable with this. He looked at the dough in her hands. "But when the time comes, if you're able..." He turned and went back out. Mara stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then she started shaping the bread again, slow, deliberate, the way she did everything, with her whole self in it. Dunmore Fitch returned on a Friday with a Casper attorney and a summons requiring Caleb to appear before the County Commissioners Board the following Monday to answer questions regarding interference with county administrative procedure. He also brought, because he was the kind of man who believed in witnesses, 6 members of the Hardin Creek Town Council, a justice of the peace, and a representative from the territorial newspaper in Casper, who had been told there was a story about a mountain rancher obstructing legitimate county business. They assembled in the yard of the Hardin Creek County office, a low building on the main street with a sign above the door that had faded to illegibility. The Commissioners' Board sat at a long table. The town council stood along the wall. The newspaper man had a notebook. A dozen townspeople had gathered at the edges, the way people gather when they have been told something official is happening and do not want to miss it. Mara Voss was in the back of the room. Fitch presented his case with the unhurried confidence of a man who had presented many cases before and won most of them. He described the placement program in generous terms. He described Caleb's interference in terms that fell just short of legal accusation. He described the ledger dispute as a misunderstanding arising from the complexity of county accounting. He said the name Mara Voss twice, and both times the word mute followed it like a shadow. Not spoken aloud, but present, the way some words are present in a room without being said. The placement itself, Fitch said, wrapping up, has been a matter of public record since January. The woman was placed through the county's legitimate program. There is no irregularity. The justice of the peace, a gray-haired man named Wetton, who had the look of someone who had seen many things he wished he hadn't, turned to Caleb. "Do you have anything to add, Mr. Holt?" Caleb nodded once. "I have a ledger. I have correspondence." He set the papers on the table. The accounting speaks for itself. Wetton looked at the papers. He looked at Fitch. He looked briefly at Mara at the back of the room. He did not ask her anything. She had not expected him to. "Is there anything else to be entered into the record?" Wetton said. Fitch spread his hands, a gesture of magnanimous completion. And then Mara Voss opened her mouth. The first sound was rough. 11 months of disuse had made it rough, had dried the channel and narrowed it, and the first syllable came out scraped and imperfect, barely audible. The second was stronger. By the third she had found it, found the thing that had been sitting at the bottom of her throat for a year like silt, and she began to move it. "My name," she said. And the room went the kind of quiet that a room only goes when something entirely unexpected has occurred, "is Mara Voss. I was placed at the Holt property in January. I was placed through a program administered by Dunmore Fitch. I would like to enter into the record that on the second Thursday of my placement, I was approached by a county deputy who told me that my continued assignment depended on my willingness to provide a weekly report board of Caleb Holt's land use activities to the Commissioner's office." She paused. Her voice had cleared fully now. It was low and unhurried, and she used it the way she used everything, with precision, without waste. I did not agree. I would also like to note that I am not mute. I simply had not, until now, heard a question in this county worth answering. The room was very still. Dunmore Fitch had gone the color of old ash. The newspaper man from Casper was writing very fast. Wetton set down his pen and looked at Fitch for a long moment. Then he turned back to Mara. "Ma'am," he said, "I'll need you to swear to that formally." "I will swear to it as many times as required," Mara said. The Commissioners' Board dissolved Fitch's placement program entirely by the end of the month. A territorial investigation was opened. 3 of the 7 placement fees were found to have been diverted. Fitch resigned his commissioner's position in March and left Garfield County before the investigation concluded. Winter broke early that year. By the end of April, the aspen were budding, and the mountain road had dried enough that Peavy's supply wagon could make it up in less than 3 hours. On a morning in early May, Pearl Holt found the first wild columbine of the season at the edge of the upper pasture and brought it back to the kitchen, carrying it very carefully with both hands, and set it in a tin cup of water on the table next to the sourdough pot. "It matches the pot," Pearl said, looking at it. Mara looked at the columbine and looked at the clay pot and looked at Pearl. "It does," she said. Pearl beamed. The unguarded, full-face beam of a 7-year-old who has just received something she did not ask for. Then she went outside. Caleb was at the table. He had heard. He was looking at his coffee cup with the careful attention of a man who is trying to conceal that he has been affected by something. "You talked to her," he said. "I did." A pause. "You could have talked to her before?" "Yes." He looked up from the cup then, fully, the way he rarely did. "Why now?" Mara considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because someone asked something worth answering," she said. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, in the plain, economical way of a man who had learned that words were most powerful when fewest, "I'd like you to stay." "I know," Mara said. "Is that a yes?" "That is a yes." Outside, Pearl was moving through the new grass with the particular purposeful wandering of a child who has decided the world is worth exploring again. The mountain stood behind the house the way it always had, large and unhurried and older than anyone's grief, bringing its dead up through the snow each spring without apology, as it had for 1,000 years before any of them were here and would for 1,000 years after. On the kitchen table, the columbine stood in its tin cup, holding itself upright in the morning light, taking up every inch of space it was entitled to.